Okay, so as I explained just in the talk before, data plays a major strategic role in the development of AI, and this panel will focus on that, and we will be discussing all the issues related to data. I'm very honored to moderate this panel with such high-level panelists. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. And I would like to start right away. I will let you in turns to maybe introduce yourself and what is your expertise and what you are doing. And to start, I would like you to spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes commenting on how strategic the role of data in AI is and whether it can be considered as an asset as infrastructure is or talent is. And Rumi, if you want to start, please.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Emmanuel, for the kind introduction, and also my pleasure to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. Rumi Chunara, I'm an associate professor at NYU in the School of Global Public Health in biostatistics, as well as in computer science. And so, across those two spaces, we're able to bridge this kind of new world of data and AI and its utility in health. And so I also direct a center for health data science, which also aims to foster that bridge. And so, besides our research efforts, which are largely focused on not just health care and machine learning, but also thinking about well-being, quality of life outside the hospital, and where that machine learning AI piece fits in. We've also been able to work with a lot of health systems. So through the NYU health system here, as well as the New York City Health and Hospitals, that's the largest safety net system hospital in the US, as well as a little bit with the WHO data analytics team to think both about their use of modern AI methods, prediction, and what that means, as well as the workforce in all of those spaces. And so how people are kind of getting upskilled into working with newer technologies.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Solon Barocas. I'm a researcher at Microsoft Research, which is the company's pure research division. I also have a faculty appointment in the information science department at Cornell. My own work over the past 10, 15 years or so has been broadly in the area of ethics and policy of AI and machine learning. I've done a lot of work specifically on issues of fairness and accountability, and a lot of my work has historically focused on the use of AI in high stakes decisions. So think of things like the use of AI for employment or employment decisions or credit decisions or admissions decisions, things of that type. A lot of my early work was trying to show that the kinds of models that we build for these kinds of high stakes decisions can really inherit a lot of the qualities that we often want to stamp out of these high stakes decision making when they're made by humans. And that's because a lot of these models are trained on data that comes from prior human decision making, or that is just sort of an artifact of the way the world currently works. And so data is the kind of like lifeblood of these models, and what is encoded in that data can often then be reflected in how the model itself will operate. And I think that has become well understood over the past 5 years in particular. But when I was sort of starting off in this area, it took some time to help communicate that these are quite different than maybe the way you would think of traditional computer programming, because there isn't the same way in which human influence has an effect on the way decisions are made. So that continues to be the focus of a lot of my work. Things have changed quite a lot in the past few years because of the move to these new generative models. But even there, you can still see in many ways that the data that we use to build these much larger models also can encode all sorts of beliefs and perspectives that then get reflected in the way it behaves. And so in the way that we can think of AI as data as an important resource, we should also understand that the resource itself kind of comes along with a bunch of other qualities that we might be concerned with. So I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that on the panel today. Thanks.
Thank you, Solon. Thank you very much. Sunu, it's your turn.
Thank you, Manuel. Yeah. So my name is Sunu Engineer, and I am a cosmologist by profession, and I have been working in AI and data science for a long time, both related to cosmology and otherwise. And for the last 5 to maybe 7 years, I've been working on building the data empowerment and protection architecture, designing and building the AI strategies for India as a nation as a part of our India stack. And over the last couple of years, we've been focusing on how AI can be integrated with society, right, at scale, and what are the impacts of data sharing on societies at scale.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we have, as you see, we have a very high level panel. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting panel. So let's start right away. And when we talk about the strategic role of data, of course, I guess we are all thinking about all the bottlenecks and the challenges related to data. And there are many, many of them. To name maybe the first two, but I will name some other ones later. The quality of data plays a very important role, and the representativity of data also it plays a very important role. So maybe first of all, I discussed this subject already in the course just before, but I think it's nice to have another definition because we always, I mean, we're all kind of experts of all that, but we have our point of view, and it's nice to hear different definitions. So maybe Sunu, you could explain what we mean by quality of data, and then Rumi
Okay.
and Solon, I guess, representativity and bias and all that stuff. Please.
All right. Thank you, Manuel. So data is a very term with a lot of different levels of ramifications and meanings. Technically, all the data that we are talking about today is digital data specifically, is record of the past events, right? And the people who recorded them and the systems who recorded them did not always record them in ways that were compatible, either in structure or in meaning. So data, even though we say we have lots of data regarding our world, which is being collected from a diverse set of data sources or data sensors, it is not compatible with each other. It doesn't work together. The data quality, as in, can we take different pieces of data and use it to reconstruct the models? Because at the end of the day, we want data to construct models for possibly for predicting the future so that we can figure out how to solve problems that may occur later in the future and use our past as learning. So data quality today has lots of issues. Well, the first one being the fact that they are in silos. They are in silos within countries, they are in silos across countries, and we are not able to put them together. And even when we cross over all the national issues and the various barriers which are there, including different types of regulations for data privacy, and try to put data together, you will find that it is sparse, missing many dimensions where there needs to be sufficient density in order for it to be glued together. And there is a lot of inconsistency and error in the data. I would say that we could go on about it, but there are many dimensions to it. But I think the rest of the data problems, I will let Rumi speak about it.
So Rumi, everybody, Solon, Rumi, feel free to comment on it. And please, if one of you could talk about what representativity is and rebounds on what Sunu said also.
Maybe I'll let Solon's done some seminal work in this area. Why don't you go ahead and I can
Solon.
follow up?
Sure. So this concept of representativeness is one from statistics, and it refers to the idea that when we're collecting data about a population, that the sample that we're collecting somehow represents the full population, even though the sample by definition is not the full population. And when we're collecting this data, if it fails to be representative, meaning that it doesn't sort of represent the population in proportion to their different groups, then the analysis that we perform on that data might lead to misleading conclusions. And so in the case of some of these AI models, what that can mean concretely, so if I stick to an example I was mentioning earlier, if we're thinking about like the use of these models in employment, if the data that we train these models on to assess job applicants tends to come from one particular country, and then we're using the same model to assess applicants who come from a very different country, which maybe has a completely different educational system, then the model might struggle because the data is not going to be representative of this different population. And so this is a routine problem that people encounter. It's a often difficult challenge to overcome, in part because you might not even be aware that your data is not representative. So you might have some vague sense that perhaps it's not perfectly representative of the population that you want to to apply the model to, but it may not be clear exactly how it's not representative. And so this is a really difficult, often pernicious problem that requires a lot of attention and work. Sometimes people take the view that as we kind of scale up, as we're using larger and larger data sets, that like quality becomes less of an issue because scale just somehow solves the problem of representativeness or quality. But again, you can even see this problem with these giant models more recently. So for example, these generative models tend to do a lot better in English than they do in other languages because there's less data from non-English languages. They tend to do better on the kinds of tasks that are performed in Western countries because we have less data from other parts of the world. And so this is another way in which the kind of lack of representativeness then manifests as challenges for the accuracy and success of these larger models. So even at the largest scales, right, we're talking about like the kind of cutting edge models here, the lack of data from certain places continues to mean that these models will work less well for certain parts of the world and certain populations than others.
Feel free, Rumi. You
Yeah,
can go on. All of you can feel free to just skip in the discussion whenever you want, please.
Yeah, I mean, those Sunu and Solon made great points. And just to kind of emphasize and build on it, the issue for, as all of you who are, representatives for governments, as policy kind of view, the issue is that a lot of times the data will be missing or not representative along the same lines as some of the populations who are already marginalized due to other issues. And so that's going to augment any kind of conclusions or challenges or decisions that are made. I'll just build on as well this issue of data quality and what that means. I think it's very important as a lot of times we're capturing data to represent individuals, in different scenarios or domains. And another thing that just kind of want to bring to the table is also this idea of what we capture as data. So before we even have this picture of what are we going to encode in the digital sense, that can also further restrict what kinds of questions we can ask or decisions that can be made. And I'll just make that a little bit tangible from the health side, which is where we often work. And oftentimes we're thinking about health of populations, and when they are seen, by a physician or a clinician in a health situation, we sometimes don't have all of the background needed in a data situation. We want to make sure people are healthy and not just know about like their status when they come to the hospital, but how are they able to engage in exercise or nutrition? And sometimes those factors aren't well brought into the data picture in any given scenario, even here in the US. And so just what it is that we're capturing as data can also influence our decisions and perhaps make them more individualized for better or for worse, versus thinking about some of the more structural things that we can change potentially in a given place.
So one more thing that I would like to add, following up on what Rumi was saying, is the following. As I said, data is a record of the past, and some set of events were happening in the past, right? And what is quality data? Quality data consists of a set of samples which allows you to reconstruct that past phenomenon as accurately as possible, right? It's one way of thinking about it. Now, there are mathematical parallels to it in signal processing and so on, right? When you sample a signal to find the numbers that you can use it to represent the signal. But this way of thinking about data, that I heard a story, I have some data elements about that story. With those data elements, can I reconstruct the story as it happened? Whether it is in the case of health, a financial situation, this gives you a very good idea about the quality of data. And unfortunately,
Sorry, no, yeah, should we be afraid of just having system replicating the past then?
No, that's not the point. The point is that after we capture the data, then we can sample it. Yeah. Now, so this is a question of measuring data quality, right? You have to know whether you have got the right data. So for example, there is data representing, let us say, a social situation. And when we sample the data, we have to have a statistical distribution which samples the situation as it happened, right? Whether there is bias or not. And then we can filter it out because we are going to use it for a future purpose. Then we can modify the data for the future purpose. That is a different call. Yeah, that's my point.
But then I think this is
Yeah,
interesting,
sorry.
whether by just looking at the data, this is at the best, it will give you very precise information about the past. How can we
Yeah.
generalize from that? And are we not just replicating each time there's the past? And how can we create something new?
Oh, absolutely true. So this is just about looking at this is a way of thinking about the quality of the data. Now, how to predict the future from that data is a separate problem. You should not think that just because we collected data, it means that we will just replicate the past. That is a separate problem. It comes out of the predictive model, which will use the data in order to compute the future predictions, which are probabilistic anyway.
Everybody agrees on that? Okay. So, Solon, you talked about the size. I think it was you. And so I don't know, like Rumi in health, what is most important, the size of the database or the quality of the database? Even for, I'm not talking about these big LLMs. I'm even talking about classical supervised AI. Would you
Yeah.
rather have a huge database, which is not of very good quality, or a small but very good quality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Emmanuel. Because what's going to happen when you have lower quality but more data is you're more prone to errors, right? Whether they're biased in one direction or random. And the issue with areas like health, where we work, is that it's kind of safety critical, right? So we don't want any small errors for anybody because that could represent like a very important false positive or false negative in a diagnosis, in catching something important. So I would say on the health side, the errors are very critical and we want to minimize those. And that comes into play whether you're looking at classical risk prediction, supervised models, or generative AI. And that we need to make sure we mitigate any of those. Yeah.
Okay. And we haven't talked about another factor. I don't know who wants to talk about it, which is interoperability.
Well, I could talk a bit about interoperability because it is one of the problems that I struggle with on a daily basis. And then Solon and others, everybody, please, feel free. But interoperability is the big problem in our life. All these data sets exist, and we need to connect them together. So I usually call it the collect, correct, and connect phenomenon, right, of data, so that we can actually convert data to information and information to knowledge, so that we can use them better in our models. So the interoperability problem comes from the fact that different people, when they collected data about that same phenomenon, they looked at small pieces of it because they could not collect the data about the whole thing. There's too much of it, and too many different perspectives need to be used in order to collect the data. They collected. You could think of it as each one collecting their own perspective, data from their own perspective. And then they went around representing the data in their own formats. So now not only structures are incompatible, but the meaning is also missing. And then on top of it, there is a lot of regulatory control because the data refers to privacy, to specific individuals, and so on. So on top of these internal inconsistencies and incompleteness in the data space, you also have these regulatory structures, which makes interoperability, as Emmanuel is well aware, a very difficult problem to solve, especially across countries and things like that. I think I'll stop there, but I'll let others comment on it.
Somebody wants to comment, or do you want to move on? We can move on. So we talked about quality, representativity, size, semantic interoperability, or syntactic interoperability. And then there is another, which is of a different sort. It's not as technical, even though all these factors have direct impact, very important impact, which is the governance. So we all know it can be really hard to access to data. So it depends, of course, on the sensitivity of data. I'm doing health, so I guess, and Rumi also, I guess we share the same thing about how complex it can be to access data. In Europe, it was really the pain in the neck a few years ago. It is a little bit better, but we have a long way to go still. I mean, it's been a nightmare to access to health data. Regulation was pretty heavy, particularly on personal data with the GDPR. So how is it in the US? So we could distinguish different levels. So there are at the level of its institution, or at the level of a state, or directly the US. And then for India, Sunu. I don't know who wants to take the US part, Solon or Rumi. Talk about HIPAA a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I can start a little bit. Sure, thanks, Emmanuel. Right. So in the US, just a little bit of history about um, individuals' health data. There's always been, well, since has been in place for several decades, there's been at least some awareness and idea to protect that individual data. That would what would fall under the purview before a lot of AI changes is things like genetic data, any kind of information from research studies or in the clinic that was gathered. And so there have been regulations around that in terms of making sure data sharing is under the appropriate constraints, that there are processes and guardrails around that. So of course this becomes much more relevant when we are talking about not just the collection of a lot more types of data in clinical or other health situations, but also now the utility of that data in risk, for example, risk prediction models that are being, again, used to make decisions for other patients. So that's a little bit of background about HIPAA in the US. I think I would say in the US, a lot of things happen at different levels, like Emmanuel alluded to. So first, I'll just talk a little bit where I think there's been a little bit more movement as at the local institutional level. At least I'm in an urban area in New York. This might differ a lot when we go out to other areas of the country. Or other states. And I think there's of course, a big awareness. Now, a lot of it is addressed hand in hand with legal and other kind of partners in like a health institutions situation. And so how is that enacted? I think to date, there's a lot of practically, let's say there's a lot of awareness and regulation such that there's not any, data is kept in-house. It's not like there's a lot of movement on that side. I'll give another example though, where we do see things are being used, and because so that's on the electronic health record side, which are very prevalent in the US. And so we have kind of majority type of company happening in the US right now, Epic, which serves so many of the different kinds of hospital situations. And so they also ingest a lot of electronic health data. And so Epic does own all of that data. So when you kind of sign off at the local level, you are agreeing to being seen at some of the healthcare settings will you'll in that process you'll sign off on your data being used in that way. So then now Epic is coming back with analytic models built on aggregate data that health systems are looking at using. So there is that kind of cycle happening, and a lot of it is done, I would say, with a consent process, but really how much are individuals understanding that consent process is a large open question, right? So that's a little bit, I think, kind of institutional and industry level in the US, which I think probably would be the most prominent compared to any kind of larger regulations in that space.
Solon, you want to?
Yeah, maybe I'll add like some additional history here too. So the US famously does not have an omnibus privacy law that regulates the private sector. We have like HIPAA, which is like kind of health-specific regulation. We have a few others. And the history here is very complicated, so I won't go into the full details. But actually, the origin of privacy law in general around the world originates from an interesting debate that happened in the 1970s in the US, where there was an interest in trying to aggregate data across many federal agencies for the purposes of scientific and social scientific research. So there was the idea that many of these agencies were collecting information about their own particular area of specialization, but that if we brought this together, this would be like a very rich data set that we could, use for all sorts of beneficial research. And within a short amount of time, people began to realize that this also posed a very serious privacy risk, where the aggregation of data across these multiple areas of government would provide huge amount of insight into people's personal lives. And so this eventually led to what we have in the US called the Privacy Act, which actually limits the degree to which the federal government in the US can aggregate across multiple agencies. This is currently being challenged by the Trump administration, and we'll see what happens there. But it's interesting because what has happened in other jurisdictions is that we have a kind of set of laws that have allowed aggregation to happen. So in countries that have socialized medicine, where the state is the provider of medicine, for example, you have one provider. There is one institution that handles all of the provision of medical services, which means that you can standardize the way in which that data is collected and handled in ways that are generally much more challenging than what we have in the US, where although Epic is by far the dominant player, and just by virtue of being so dominant, has some degree of standardization influence, it's still a very different situation than what you have in places like the Northern European countries where standardized data, a remarkable degree of aggregation across not just their health system, but also their pension system and many others, which facilitates a degree of analysis that is really challenging in other kinds of jurisdictions where there just isn't the same kind of legal regime. So I think, too, when we think of kind of the effect of governance on data as a resource, this is a really illustrative example of how governance can play a really significant role in whether or not there ends up being this large set of data that can be aggregated for purposes of analysis.
Thank you. Sunu, how is it in India?
Yeah, so the story of India is a little bit different because India came late to the data space, right? So we're looking at data after 2000s, right, in the 21st century. So what we had was the ability to learn from all the attempts that were done earlier. And essentially, we leapfrogged through many of the evolutionary trajectories that others had taken to arrive at what we have today. We have our own privacy framework, which we call the DPDP Act, which goes into effect this month. It's getting enforced this month onwards. And we have other separation between personal data and non-personal data. And around that, we have a whole ecosystem of data spaces, which have been constructed by the Indian government as well as for the private use. Internally, we think of it like this, that there is something which we call type 1 data. Type 1 data is what, to go by the example that Solon was talking about, each federal agency collects its own data, and some of that data is just put out there for people to consume. You can download and do model building or whatever you want with that. So that has been a tradition, but we are finding that that is not enough because there is a lot of private data, the healthcare data, for instance, that Rumi was referring to. How do you enable this data to be shared between both private parties and between government and private parties so that ecosystems can grow? So the most recent engine that we have built for it is what we call DAPA, or the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture. But we have a cascade of different kinds of engines and models for sharing data. For example, we have something called IUDX, which is the Urban Data Exchange Program, which allows cities to exchange their smart city data in order to build transportation and various kinds of improvements around it. So we have a whole hierarchy of systems that we have built. But our basic aim is to make data economies as lightweight and free, and to have regulations built into the framework so that somebody does not have to explicitly worry about regulations when they are using data. Right. That's what I would say.
Oh, yeah, very interesting. So if I may witness what's happening in Europe about one thing, there is one major difference between HIPAA and GDPR. I don't know about India, you'll tell me, Sunu, we've never discussed about that, which is that when we take some personal data and we take out all the directly identifying fields of the data, so the name, security is a national number, or address, or exact date of birth, or stuff like that, from my understanding, when you're looking HIPAA, then you have anonymized data that you can basically open source. And this is the case of, for example, there is a very famous database for health, which is called Mimic, which is used all over the world for AI. Now, following GDPR, you don't have anonymized data. You have pseudonymized data, meaning that you are able to re-identify people if you bring some outside information about somebody that you know. And that, for example, if you have your neighbor that went to this drugstore buy this very rare drug, then you can find it in the database and then have access to all the healthcare pathway of the person. So then it's sensitive data. Then to access it, it's very difficult. You have all these governance pipeline and so on. So there is a huge difference between what's happening for database in the US and in Europe. With this thing, which is very interesting, because I discussed with the guy in charge of this database, Mimic, they are closing it because they think now that it's too dangerous. So they're closing it not because the regulation asks them to close it. So you will be able to access it online, but you won't be able to download it. They now cut that, and they try and so in some sense they are doing a step towards the GDPR, the European GDPR. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so in India, what we have, as far as health data is concerned, is that we actually have a complex ID management system. So in principle, you could say we use pseudonymized data. In India, there is something called Aadhaar or MOSEC, which is a foundational ID of every citizen. And on top of it, we have sectorial IDs. You can have your health data stored under a class of IDs, which we call the ABHA IDs. So you use the ABHA IDs to collect the data, so there is no personalized information. But in case of an emergency, if you needed to trace something down to a specific individual, right, there is a mechanism which will allow it, but in general, it cannot be exercised except under very stringent conditions, right? So we try to keep these sectorial IDs separate from the foundational ID of the individual so that we can have digital data collected in many, many spaces, right? And combined using these sectorial IDs, but without violating the privacy of the individual.
Because what we're seeing now in Europe is that all the startups, all the industries, most of them, and even researchers, they are using now US data because they are more accessible. So we are moving to AI systems that are predominantly trained on data from US, and if we are talking globally, from Western sources. And even within the US, I think I read some papers saying that it's just a few states that are involved for most of the AI data that are used for training. So the question is that, are we developing essentially an Occidental AI today? And Sunu, what is the place of India in all that? How do you see India?
So that in case of India, so we have a new initiative which is fairly recent, which we call the AI Kosh, or it's a word from Sanskrit which means the treasure of AI, treasury of AI, which contains data sets collected from various Indian contexts. For example, for us to build the Bhashini, which is an Indian language AI system, which allows completely Indian language interactions, and Indian LLMs as necessary to deal with Indian legal system and so on and so forth. So there is a new initiative to collect the data and put it into something called AI Kosh, which is actually a repository of not just data, but also AI models and so on and so forth, so that you can promote the AI ecosystem, right? But it's a fairly recent effort, and we have no
So
idea how it is going forward.
should we be afraid of today building basically a Western or even a US-based AI?
So in India,
direction?
Yeah.
Sorry.
This goes back to what Solon was saying about the question of biases happening unconsciously, accidental biases, right? So if we use the current data sets which are most easily accessible, which, like you said, are the American data sets and from other places, the Western data sets, if we use the data sets to build our LLMs or any other AI models, you will be unconsciously biased or unconsciously picking up. It'll probably be English centric For instance, if somebody's sitting in India, which in spite of its language diversity, uses English as its most common language of commerce, right, and activity, will naturally build using English data. It's unlikely to use Spanish or French or German data very in a equitable fashion. So that particular LLM is likely to have the same bias that Solon is referring to, right? So the way I think about it, right now we are talking about all the data that human agencies created, but we did not know that all that data was going to be used for building AI models. We are going to use this learning so that the future data systems will actually produce data which is intended for not humans to consume, but for AI systems to consume, right? So that we can build better models. I mean, think of the fact that we would be creating things for AI agents to consume, for instance. So we would design our data representation in that manner. That is where I hope we will go in the future.
Rumi, Solon?
Yeah, that's a very thorough picture. Thanks, Sunu. And I just wanted to also bring up something else which may be of interest to the group related to this like occidentalization, which Emmanuel mentioned, not just in terms of the actual data products and model building, but also the expertise that's now kind of not developed in certain places. So where we are collecting data, organizing it with the knowledge of how it works well in models, that's taking a lot of workforce skills that if we aren't doing that in other places, we're losing some of that expertise. And that may seem like you can skip it, but when you build models, having a good knowledge base of the data that's underlying it and how that's built is also really important, as Solon has also shared with us. So just want to mention that in terms of the population impacts.
Yeah.
Solon, do you want to know?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I could add is that in a way that might be similar to what you have with like media policy in certain markets. So like, for example, like English language television and movies can like dominate like local language content. And sometimes the state decides that it's actually worth investing tax money to support its own domestic media production. Because like it's otherwise difficult to compete with like the dominant Hollywood products. And you could imagine like a similar policy with respect to producing content for training models, right? So that the state might make decisions to subsidize the production of like local data in order to compensate for the fact that so much of the data that's otherwise available is coming from specific markets and parts of the world. So there also seems to be like an important role possibly for the state to play in trying to address exactly the kind of problem that you heard about.
Yeah, so what are the biggest risks, even in terms of geopolitical dynamics? And we are talking about, of course, alliances, trade relationships, national security concerns, and so on, but also the dominance of tech giants like the GAFAM and the BATICs. So how all the control, though, all these people, governments, determines who leads in AI innovation and technological influence globally, and what are there some really big risks or not, or how do you see that? I know it's a tough question, but
Yeah, so I can take the first shot at it. In India, we think about it in the following way, that there are data producers and there are data consumers, and data producers are the people who generate the data in various ways. Data consumers are, let's say, the people who build the models and deliver services to the world, right? But the data flows through these intermediaries like the GAFAM and others, right? And what they manage to do is that if they capture the data, they mediate the access of data, right? They capture the data through their applications, and then they mediate who can access that data in order to build the models. And this value capture is such a significant problem that out of the data economy, you will find that these big giants are capturing a lot of value, right? Which is a significant concern for countries. And so we have designed data and the whole economy in order to remove these value capturing middle layers, right? And it is one of the design goals so that data can flow from the producers to the consumers and power the economy. So this value capture is a significant concern in the data economies.
Solon, yes, please.
Yeah, I'm also happy to talk about this. So I think there's been an important shift in the move from what Emmanuel was calling the kind of traditional supervised machine learning models. So an example would be, as I was saying, kind of building a model specifically and only for the purposes of evaluating job applicants, to these new generative models like these LLMs, which are very general purpose and can kind of do all sorts of different tasks. And the reason I want to stress this distinction is that the data we use to train these models is actually quite different. So traditionally, an employer who wanted to develop a model to assess job applicants would use its own data. It would like look at its records of past employees, and the richer the data sets that they maintained, the better the models were going to be. These newer generative models are largely trained on data scraped from the web. Like it's really like publicly accessible data. And literally, I think it's fair to say that like these models are trained on like every piece of publicly accessible data that exists in the world at this point. Because the thinking is that, you know, as much data we can pour into this, the better they will be. And what that means in practice is that it's sort of the enclosure of the public commons, right? It's like all this data that was somehow available for the world to use is being churned into a model, which then presumably companies like mine will then sell access to. And that, I think, is a really significant difference. And so the kind of power that you can achieve by finding ways to make access to public knowledge available through private models is a serious risk, I think, for governments to really contemplate.
So what is the politics of Microsoft on that? How do you see the role of Microsoft or any GAFAM?
So, I mean, I think Microsoft is itself building its own models, but for the most part, it has relied on OpenAI's models. And so a lot of this has been, you know, I think pressed more by like OpenAI, by Anthropic, by these others. But it's interesting because even if you look at someone like Facebook or Meta, who has made their models publicly available, which you might think of as sort of addressing this concern, right? So that the model is not something you have to pay for access to, it's sort of available. There's still a kind of a question about like what is being made publicly accessible and what is the sort of long-term thinking here about how this will ultimately serve Meta's own interests. But I think, yeah, I think this raises a very interesting question, which is like, do we need a kind of alternative to like the corporate developed models? Is it realistic to even contemplate that there would be like a public model? These kinds of questions. And there's a lot of concerns that even come with that as well, because I think there's also worries about like, if these models are made available to anyone, then our ability to actually regulate how they're going to be used can be actually a lot more limited. And that's another topic perhaps, but yeah.
Okay, I don't know, Rumi, if you want to comment or we
I
can
think
go
that's
on.
pretty good. We can go to the next question.
Okay, so we can go on. I have many, okay, I don't know if we have time to discuss everything. So you said something that is, I guess, very, very true, which is it's not because the model is public that it's public good. So now we are moving to public good, and whether should data could be considered as a public good, and if so, to what extent, and what are the implications of framing it this way? So who wants to start on that? I think Solon, you can talk about the DeepMind when we discuss the panel. I think that would be a good start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. So an interesting example of this is that a number of years ago now, DeepMind entered into an agreement with the NHS. This is the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. Actually, this is an example of what I was even mentioning earlier. So the NHS is a national healthcare provider run by the state. It has, you know, its own electronic health records, all standardized because it's only one provider of healthcare. And so this was an extremely valuable data set, right? It's like a population level data set about health. And DeepMind wanted to be able to kind of like, develop models based on this data set. And so it seemed at the time, I think, that the government thought this was like a reasonable arrangement because like this would help, develop models that could be very useful in clinical application. But it was also criticized as this like profound giveaway to industry, which is like one of the most valuable data sets that it was maintained by the government was being made available to private actors, potentially for like private benefit. And so this was, well before some of these larger models that we were just talking about, but I think it was indicative of the kind of concerns that might come up here, right? Where the state, in many cases, maintains these like remarkably valuable data sets, which I think are reasonably understood as public goods, but it may seem necessary to collaborate with private industry to somehow do something valuable with them. But the terms of that agreement really matter a lot, right? Like to whom does the benefit of that model flow? Who has governance over those models? Who is sort of setting the agenda for how they're going to be used? Those are, I think, a lot of the questions that people felt were not adequately addressed.
Somebody else on that public good subject?
Yeah, so in India, we again face exactly the same scenario in many senses that Solon just outlined, that the government has lots of data, right? But the data is disparate, it is not continuous, and so on. However, there are many commercial benefits and things like that that can be built out of it. Now, the government is not going to sit around building these systems. So powering the private enterprise with data is the best way to grow the whole ecosystem and grow the whole economy. That we are very clear about. However, the concerns are the government has these valuable pools of data. Should it be just be handing it over to the public without any governance on how it is to be used, whether it is used in a dangerous way, acting against the society for private benefit, and so on and so forth. So the whole design of the India stack, India has a DPI stack, digital public good infrastructure stack, is designed looking at people, information, and money, the three pieces, right? And how data powers all of it, and how the end-to-end flow of people, flow of money, flow of information, all of that happens. So the way we design DPI around data just looks at these pieces. We have already designed the DPI for identity management and the people management, which we call Aadhaar. And as for other kinds of solutions where how data is exchanged, individual pieces of data is exchanged, we have special digital wallet systems which allow data to be exchanged. But if you don't put such an infrastructure in place and just release public data, which is valuable government data to the world, it may not benefit the economy. At least it will definitely not benefit the economy uniformly. So DPI has to be carefully administered, right? And properly done. It can't be done as a free for all, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, Rumi, I don't know if you want to talk. I just want to say something
Yeah.
about Europe, happening in Europe today. So there is a law that was voted at the same time as the AI Act, which is called the European Health Data Space. So it's a regulation about health data. And basically it says, it will be fully applied within 4 years, next 4 years. And basically it says that all the health data of all the member states are public good and are required to be shared, pseudonymized for research, both by industries and academic research, but all of the data. So even data from the industries, data from hospitals and so on. So everything should be shared for public interest research. This is a big, it's a very pushy law. And if you don't accept to share it, if an institution or an industry don't accept to share it, there is a fine. So it's very, very punchy. And of course, so then a lot of people say this is going to kill innovation. Nobody will work in Europe or whatever. I mean, there are major discussions about that. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Maybe I'll just chime in here and add a little bit from the previous discussion. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think it depends on who we are talking about in terms of like that innovation circle. Often, like whether it's Do you want the private industry to benefit? Do you want the state overall to benefit? Exactly. And uh, just kind of related is also this kind of the previous conversation also about open data. And I just want to share something that's come up a little bit from the research side, more in terms of supranational. So I know, Emmanuel, you wanted to talk about international cooperation, and there's been a big kind of movement, at least in the US, around like open science, which has a lot of merits and makes sense in terms of the scientific community benefiting. But I know, like, I've been involved in a larger data science project through the National Institutes of Health here across like many African countries. So we've been working with Moi University in Western Kenya to set up their data science graduate program, for example. And the thing is, like, a lot of countries that are now starting to develop their own data resources have done so after a lot different types of foundational infrastructure and resources. And so to kind of ask that they now all get on the same playing field in terms of sharing data, et cetera, comes at a bit of a disconnect where some places have already built up their expertise, their industries. And so it kind of doesn't give the other countries a chance to benefit from their own data products in the meantime. So a little bit when we talk about international cooperation, just how we're all coming from different experiences, and I'm not sure how that's gonna be able to play out in the same way for every place.
Yeah, so I can add one part to that. We do have another concern that when we release the data as a digital public good, and there are private players who actually use the data to build models and build applications and frameworks, and these frameworks are released into society as a whole, right? Now, through these frameworks, there is a huge amount of data inflow back into the system. But this is captured by that application provider, right? It's health data, it can be financial data, and so on. So we don't have a law like the law, European Health Act that Emmanuel is talking about. So we do have a concern that what happens if these private players capture the data and they don't feed it back into future data sets? So at present, what we have done is that in our data collectives, we have an ethics directive which says that you must do your best to return the data to data sets so that other people can benefit from it. But it's not a legally mandated requirement. So we do believe that there is a potential danger of, again, focusing effect and value capture from players within the country itself or within the ecosystem itself in the
Yeah, in
future.
Europe, the idea is that all the industries, they will be forced to share the data too. So after a certain period of time, like clinical trials, data from clinical trials,
Exactly.
like that. But then that could also, one of the consequences could be that they just run away and they say, okay, we don't want to work in Europe anymore. So that's a risk, whenever
Yeah.
we do regulation. And so when we're talking about public good, of course, we're talking about social benefits. And then we have to talk about the balance, very delicate, between social benefits and individual freedoms. How do we find the right balance? How can democratic societies ensure that both businesses and states use data responsibly? How to make this balance good or at a good level? Who wants to start on that? No?
Mhm.
Maybe I can start with something. Rumi, you were talking about consent. So we want individual freedom. So we want each individual to have a possibility to say, no, I don't want to share my data, for instance. Now, I must say something which is maybe not politically correct, but I think this is great that everybody could say no to the public good or to social benefits because they don't want. That's their freedom. The thing that I'm bothered with is that the answer, the no or the consent or the not consent, is based basically on fantasies. There is not at all a clear-sighted opinion or a clear-sighted decision. People are not, it's a very complex world and the world of AI and data, and people basically they are driven by fantasies that can be dystopic, like, oh, my data is going to be used by the insurance companies and so on, and there will be leaked, and this is really bad, and Google will listen to me and so on. Or totally utopic fantasies about like cancer will no longer exist in 10 years thanks to AI and so on. And today, I think that most of the people, when they give or not the consent to share the data, it's based on that. I mean, they are just, this is nonsense. So is it the right way to operate? I don't know.
So what I can speak about that is that in general, we have built a consent-based architecture, but as you said, it is more make-believe than reality. This is I'm being honest about it here, because the people who are giving the consent are not able to visualize what will happen to their data, right? What is the consequences of sharing this data, etc. And even we who have been in data spaces and looked at the modeling using data, etc., it is not an easy problem to solve, right? So how do we get consent from people with a clear understanding is very difficult, because you will have to have a very long conversation with them. And that is not the way these data gathering systems are designed at present. What we have been doing in terms of building a DPI for data sharing and things like that is to try and use technology as an intervening bus, right? Whatever technology can do today in terms of technological architecture, how much of, so we use, for example, what we call confidential clean rooms, environments where data can be processed with nobody being able to see the data, right? Now, it is not a full guarantee that privacy is being maintained, but then we add on additional techniques like differential privacy, and then we verify the models using various model checking routines and things like that. So what we are doing in the Indian DPI model is to create a techno-legal framework. Unlike in the United States, our legal system is a little bit slow and hampered. You can have contracts, but getting the contracts honored through the legal system is going to take a long time. So we cannot
But
rely fully on legal
I'm sorry,
systems.
Sunu, let me be a little bit provocative.
Yeah.
Do you think that the citizen needs this contract to really take a clear-sighted decision? I don't think it's
No,
related at all.
no,
I don't
no,
think it
no,
doesn't
no.
care at all.
No.
It's
So
not a
let me be
problem. It's
very
not the
clear.
issue.
Yeah, let me be very clear. The problem that you began with, citizens' consent, is not a problem that we have been able to solve as well, right? So we are just doing one level above it and saying that whatever data that you have given, we can put an additional layer of privacy over it technologically, right? So again, please remember, it is, from my perspective, it is wrapping the problem, not solving the problem, right? That is what we have done currently to improve the adoption.
Rumi, I feel you want to say
Yeah,
something.
I mean, I think it's a great conversation. I think although maybe it's idealistic, I do feel like, we some level of data literacy and appreciation from the public side is needed for like a truly, true understanding and potentially advantageous. Sometimes I guess I'll mention a couple, like one other thing is sometimes we often view consent and privacy only at the individual level. Perhaps it might benefit us to think about it more at the community level. Maybe there might be certain communities or groups that can come together and decide what they would like to use their data on with enough room for discussion about that. There was this effort in the US, the All of Us data set, where people would opt in to share some of their health related data, and there's a lot of energy and investment to enable that.
But we know the problem of opt-in. Opt-in leads to biased data, no? Kind of, because you only have
Yes, there have been some studies around that, but I think I don't know how this was addressed in totality, but they did make a lot of efforts to reach groups that often didn't, in the past, in history, would not have contributed. But I'm curious to see how that evolved. So that is a problem, and maybe we can make some other efforts on that. There are large it's small, maybe academic works around community engagement and that kind of thing, but perhaps those are the ones we need to see more of.
Maybe I'll
Solon?
say a few things as well. So I think it's fair to say that like over the past decade, there's been a growing realization that this kind of notice and consent approach is sort of bankrupt, frankly.
Yes.
That, you know, people cannot possibly really be informed, that they're inundated with these kinds of decisions all the time. And so there's just kind of going to be fatigue in terms of making these decisions. And so a lot of legislative efforts, including actually, frankly, the GDPR, has sort of moved away from consent as being like the primary mechanism to try to address the interests of data subjects. I think the role of consent in healthcare is still important and has sort of like a somewhat exceptional quality compared to maybe other areas. But in general, I think if you look at the GDPR, there's like many other ways in which they try to balance different interests. And so, you know, one way of trying to determine whether or not data collection and processing is justified is like legitimate use, like this legitimate interest question, not just whether or not people actually consent. And even though we in the US don't have anything even remotely similar to the GDPR, there's still like legislative efforts to move towards something that's closer to this model. The thing I think that's also quite interesting, though, about the past couple of years is that historically, I think a lot of the reason we were interested in consent is we worried that like the data that we might be contributing to some institution might be used against us in ways that we might not like. And it's literally the exact data that we gave that we thought might come back to haunt us. So if you're thinking about like health data in particular, you know, if your health data reveals some stigmatized disease, you would be concerned that like that might be used against you, right? So like your employer might discriminate against you because you have some disability, for example. And so there was a lot of attention paid to whether or not you can guarantee the protection of that data, whether or not people understood the risk that they might be taking on by agreeing to share this. I think now, though, the questions are somewhat different. I think when people contemplate like what might happen with this newer wave of AI, it's less like, oh, is this data going to be directly used against me? And more like, am I contributing to the development of an AI system that might be used in many other ways that are not like individually targeting me based on my data, but are just being used for purposes I don't agree with, right? So, like if you think about the protests that happened around kind of creative workers, you know, it's like illustrators and others who felt that like they were in direct competition with these models that had been trained on their data. Um, like it's not a privacy concern, right? It's more of like a kind of commercial concern, like how is this actually changing the labor market? How is this actually? And I think these are the kinds of questions that have become perhaps more salient, right? Which is like, how do you exercise democratic control over the particular purposes that these AI systems are being developed to serve, which is different than the kind of historical concern we would have with privacy, which is like, do I want to contribute this data even though there might be a risk that I could be harmed by the particular disclosure of this individual piece of data? So I think, you know, whether consent or traditional data governance mechanisms are the right way to think about how to exercise democratic control over the applications of this general purpose technology, that to me is like a really unsettled question.
So, and that will be my last question, but
So,
please answer quickly because we don't have that much time, and it's a very complex question. But then we are talking about regulation, basically, and then how to do the best regulation. This is a whole subject. But then my question is that I'm from Europe. How do we have any chance to be still in the race of AI in 10 years if we are fighting with some countries that totally deregulate? What should we do? What can do? Is there a hope for us to be somewhere, or did we already lose the race?
I would suggest one very important thing. The regulation is good when regulation can be implemented quickly, right? And so if you think of regulating using AI as the regulator, right, then you don't have human oversight all the time. That is, in the regulatory system, there is a human oversight and there is technical element. You expand the technical element so you can maintain your regulatory oversight and perhaps just accelerate the whole process. So you don't have to give up the European model, right? And still compete. Without that, I find that if you use just a human regulatory pipeline, the speed becomes so slow that competition might not be very feasible.
Okay.
That would be my
I hope
direct
you are
comment.
true. I'm not so sure, but I hope you are true. So
Thank
who
you
wants
for
to
that.
take 1 minute?
Thank you. Daniela Vargas, I work for the UN, and thank you for a very interesting panel indeed. I have a question. Well, given we are in a, of course, globalized world, and that many of these data also has global implications, being health or climate or all of these things, but also some of the risks that you were mentioning in terms of, for instance, underrepresented populations being further marginalized, etc. Which role, if at all, do you see in an international organization and let's say a multilateral agreement playing in this situation, in this context?
I know that, sorry, I start, but I know that during the summit, there was this AI summit in Paris. I know that Yann Lequin proposed that countries contribute to a shared open source AI model using data centers distributed around the world. So there would be money to deploy data centers everywhere so that we could train. But I don't know if it's just a dream or if it's something that could come true. Who wants to? This is a tough question. You see, nobody
It's a
knows
tough
how to
question.
answer that.
It is not an easy question to answer. I cannot even think of a uniform answer.
Yeah, it's likely that this is not going to be possible, and we don't see any solution to that. This
Yeah.
is so hard to deploy at a global level. It is already so hard to deploy at a national level that at a global. But I agree that we should work also at a global level. Well, at least in Europe, what we did is that we are already working, even though the problems are not solved at all at the national level, we are already working at a European level. But it's not enough. Clearly, it's not enough.
So
I mean, we have to work globally.
I can give one speculative answer, but I must be upfront that this is a speculation. It's a piece of thinking that I've been working on. Is that we have these large central engines like OpenAI engines and things like that, but instead of OpenAI being trained on data and giving an answer based on OpenAI's data, when it finds a question with respect to, say, a remote country in Africa or South America, it actually delegates it to another LLM, right, which is built out of the data of that country in that particular country, so that data samples and the linguistic samples, etc., are maintained. So instead of having some big central LLMs, right, central large AI intelligences controlling AI, we have a network of AI intelligences, which when they get a question, actually make a decision and delegate it. But again, this is a highly speculative structure to address this problem.
So next question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry for the science fiction answer, but yeah, that's
Colleagues, thanks so much. Just had a quick question, and Sunu, you did allude to this. In India, you mentioned a national ID system and a database that underpins it. And in a context where you see pushback against migration, pushback against citizenship being granted to religious minorities, what are the guardrails for weaponization and against weaponization and manipulation of these data sets? Is it the state monitoring itself, or are there solutions where you put this data out there as a public good, holding the government or the state accountable in an attempt where manipulation can take place, particularly in the context of denying access of rights?
Yeah. So the answer to that is that the system was originally conceived as independent of the state. It was taken up by the state and deployed nationwide in order to provide this. And then out of the original, so the state implementation of the ID system, the foundational ID system is called Aadhaar. And then we created another organization called MOSIP, which actually created an ID system, which is used by many other countries like Morocco, Ethiopia, and so on, right? We actually license that as an open source product for other people to use. And our vision is that the state does not weaponize it. For example, remember I told you that there is the hierarchy of other IDs, sectorial IDs, right? There is no way the state can state can deconstruct it, right? The system is designed in the Indian digital environment is designed in such a way that using this particular foundational ID, there can be no state surveillance whatsoever possible, right? The state cannot find out where you are traveling, what bank transactions you are doing, etc. Although these IDs enable us to do automatic bank transactions, which we call UPI across the system, right? But surveillance is not possible. However, in spite of it, can this be weaponized by denying people entry into the system, etc., right? Which is not the question of the technology, but which is the question of the social implementation. That is quite, yeah, it is beyond my capability to say that whether it can be weaponized. But yes, I can imagine that a state level regulation can be passed, which says that certain classes of people are not allowed entry or not allowed to be part. But one thing I can be sure about is that the judicial system of India would almost certainly step in and prevent it from happening if the state tried to weaponize it that way.
Hello, hi.
Let's take two questions.
Yeah. This is the first question. So as you may know, first of all, it was very interesting. And as you may know, we are all diplomats, most of us working at the UN or UN officials. So my question is related to, from one side, we have the UN in a huge financial crisis that will bring us to major cuts. On the other side, we have a peaceful army of UN experts that are highly qualified, highly educated, working all over the world with all kinds of nationalities that work in 6 different languages. This seems to me like a huge database to deal with ethics, deal with many issues. And we have member states that kind of struggle how to work with this. And we have a UN Tech Envoy, SG Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. How can, my question is, how do you suggest, from your point of view, member states and the UN navigate to try to deal a potential crisis on a potential next level of ethical data to be shared to bring the AI to the next level? Thank you.
And thank you for this very thought-provoking panel. And I have actually 2 questions. One is related to my personal experience when using ChatGPT, and the other is much broader in the data economy. By the way, I'm sharing from China. So first of all, when using generative AI, and sometimes for academic purposes, like asking AI to drop a literature review for me. And sometimes I feel that they actually fabricate references that do not actually exist. So I'm wondering, what are the technical or structural reasons behind this hallucination behavior? And are there any prompt design strategies that we could limit the likelihood of such errors? And actually more broadly, what are the best practices for UN researchers to verify and responsibly use these AI-generated contents? And the second question is, when I was in China, I heard from some business leaders talking about how behavior data has been increasingly used to guide commercial decision-making. For example, if a 30-year-old woman buying coffee in a certain shop at a certain time, and sometimes some kind of companies like bank or Alipay system or like supervision camera assistants or the coffee shops, they can actually probably aggregate this behavior pattern. And these insights are then sold to other competing coffee shops based on the assumption that individual behavior patterns which share similar geographical or behavior profiles will exhibit similar consumption habits. So, and then it triggers a lot of debates inside the government, and the government now is debating on should the government step in to regulate how such data is collected, aggregated, or should we allow more space for the private sectors so that they could compete freely in this evolving process? Thank you. That's my question.
I get, maybe this is the citation question. The first one, Emmanuel, is that right?
was about
The first one is about the United Nations being a very
Oh my
diverse
gosh.
environment. Yeah, very diverse environment with many data sources and many countries. How will they create a collaborative environment? If you are looking at just the United Nations as an organization itself and solving the problem of data collaboration within that, I presume that under the umbrella of some major organization like ITU, for example, this could be made possible because the way I think about it is if United Nations cannot come together and share the data, imagine how we will get the rest of the world to come together and share their data, right? The problem is at two different scales. So maybe by having the digital organization, they would solve the problem because there are many technical ways of doing it, as well as many collaborative and cooperative ways of doing that. That would be this thing. As for the citation problem, there's a very quick analogy that I often give as an answer to this, is that when human beings do agriculture, right, and when you are harvesting the grain or harvesting fruit or whatever it is, all the fruit that you get is not of good quality. But somewhere at the point of consumption, you are going to apply a filter and use the good quality fruit or good quality grain, right? You must assume that the AI cannot be relied on to produce 100% good quality things. And it is just going to shorten when you're trying to look for references and citations, right? It is going to do the work, and something that would have taken many hours is shortened into a much shorter period of time. But it is not going to be very short because it is best that you still look at it, right? And you may use AI itself to verify it, but this verification process is to be thought of just like consuming agricultural produce.
So very quickly answer to hallucination question and behavioral data. Who wants to take hallucination question?
I could say something very quickly. So, I mean, I think one very important thing to understand about this newer generation of models is that as much as they seem to replicate kind of human cognition, they really are quite different. So, like, the reason these things hallucinate, and even the word hallucinate, I think, has an anthropomorphic quality, which is perhaps like, unfortunate, is that what they're really trying to do is like predict what are likely next words to occur in a particular sequence of words. And so it's just sort of like learning from huge data sets, like what is the frequency with which certain words kind of go together. And so you might think that that's a very simplistic way to try to like build these models that are capable of very complex tasks. But it turns out this can work surprisingly well. But it also means that like things that are probabilistically likely are things that it will output, but they don't necessarily have to be true, right? So you get these like citations that look very plausible. And the reason they look plausible is because they are probabilistically likely, but they actually don't refer to something that is true. And so they are not operating the way that we as humans would, where we would actually know that this is a fact of the world and we should be relying on this particular thing. And so the fluency of these models, I think, is the thing that makes them dangerously seductive, because you see this, it looks coherent and plausible, but in fact, like this is not the same way that humans would actually arrive at those kinds of outputs.